glass of water.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Rules Committee. Folks were wondering what the paper is. It's not for our friends from the Financial Services Committee. It's for our friends from HASC, as we will get into NDAA later on in the day. If you were looking for Mr. Sessions here, please keep him in your thoughts. His youngest graduated from high school today, and so that work is done. He was there at the celebration this morning. He won't be back here until late tonight, but please give him your congratulations when you see him. The hearing today will focus on three measures: S-204, the Right to Try Act; S-2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act; and H.R. 5515, the FY19 National Defense Authorization Act. S-204 and S-2155 are the products of long negotiations between the House and the Senate, and I'm happy to say it feels like we're ready to make these bills law, or at least are in those final steps. We'll hear today from Representative Blaine Luetkemeyer from Missouri and Representative Maxine Waters from California from the Financial Services Committee on the merits of S-2155. Then we'll move to our second panel and hear from Representative Joe Martin of Texas and Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey, representing the Energy and Commerce Committee on the merits of S-204. And then finally, our third panel for all the paper will be Mike Rogers from Alabama and Adam Smith from Washington State to present FY19 NDAA. Considering how many measures we have to get through, I am prepared to begin with our witnesses, but I want to first defer to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern.
So I'm determined and committed to trying to make the Rules Committee more user-friendly, so I will not have a statement, and I will yield back my time and go right to the witnesses.
I thank the gentleman. We will begin with our first panel. The chair recognizes Mr. Luetkemeyer from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and ranking member, Mr. McGovern, and members of the Rules Committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today on S-2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. The Senate passed S-2155 on March 14th by a strong bipartisan support vote of 67 to 31. I'm particularly proud to say that approximately half of the provisions in the bill, including 78% of the regulatory relief provisions and 88% of the capital market provisions, originated in the House. This bill will provide long overdue relief from the regulatory behemoth that is Dodd-Frank, a law which has sidelined trillions of dollars in capital, increased the cost of financial products, and negatively and unnecessarily affected millions of Americans' ability to obtain loans of any kind. Americans were promised comprehensive financial reform that would lift the economy. In reality, it has burdened us with substantial red tape, causing Americans to suffer through the slowest, weakest, and most tepid recovery in the last 70 years. Big banks are growing bigger and bigger, while the nation is losing, on average, more than one community financial institution a day. This makes it harder for American consumers and businesses to access the credit they need to buy a car, achieve the dream of home ownership, or grow capital and expand their businesses and create jobs. As a result, we've seen what researchers at the University of Maryland have cited as a redistribution of credit from middle-class households to wealthy households. Consumers across the country have seen their free checking disappear, and their average monthly fees triple in the last 8 years. Too many Americans are struggling to qualify for a mortgage or car loan. Consumers are paying more and are getting much less. But don't take just my word for it. Listen to a gentleman named William who says after Dodd-Frank, he could no longer find a free checking account in his hometown of Nicholsville, Kentucky, unless he kept an average monthly balance of $3,000, and I quote, "Most of us don't have that kind of money to keep in a checking account." William's story is all too common. Unfortunately, the effects of the current regulatory regime don't just impact consumers shopping for a bank account or a home mortgage. When it comes to small businesses, America's job-creating engine, the regulatory burden is all too real. According to the FDIC, small business loans declined 13% between 2008 and 2017. The Federal Reserve also noted that an additional 25% of small businesses that want and need loans didn't even bother applying for financing because the process was too daunting or the cost of borrowing was too high. After 8 years of failed economic policies that led to the slowest and weakest recovery in the modern era, the economy is starting to take off and wages are finally growing again. Consumer optimism abounds. We're averaging 3% growth. Unemployment remains at a 17-year low. Wages grew at 2.9%, the fastest in almost 10 years. 2 million Americans have gone back to work. However, we cannot rely only on a 3% growth tax package. We must enact pro-growth regulatory reforms that make it more efficient for Main Street businesses to access capital and fuel growth. S2155 is one giant step in the right direction, providing much-needed pro-growth regulatory reform and relief for our nation's community financial institutions. S2155 contains so many important provisions long championed by our House colleagues. Some examples: H.R. 2226, the Portfolio Lending and Mortgage Access Act by Congressman Barr out of Kentucky. H.R. 3971, the Community Institution Mortgage Relief Act, sponsored by Claudia Tenney of New York. H.R. 4725, the Community Bank Reporting Relief Act, sponsored by Randy Holcomb of Illinois. And H.R. 4771, the Small Bank Holding Company Relief Act from Mia Love of Utah, just to name a few. These measures stand as perfect examples of all the great work the House has been doing to look out for Main Street financial institutions, businesses, and their customers. While my colleagues and I would have welcomed the inclusion of more of the many strongly bipartisan bills that we have already passed in the House, I'm here to state our support for S2155. Legislation will help our constituents achieve financial independence, whether they are a part-time worker, a single mom, a small business owner, or an entrepreneur. I look forward to getting this legislation on the President's desk. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I look again for the opportunity to testify before you and answer any questions you may have.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The gentlelady from California, the ranking member.
Thank you very much. Members of the Rules Committee, I strongly oppose S2155, the so-called Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act. It was just 10 years ago when weak safeguards, lax rules, and predatory lending led to a catastrophic financial crisis that nearly destroyed our economy. Americans lost $13 trillion in household wealth, 9 million people lost their jobs, and 11 million lost their homes. Congress responded by enacting the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010 to rein in the risky behavior of Wall Street and other financial institutions, strengthen protections for consumers and investors, and establish prudent safeguards to protect our economy from another financial crisis. And just a decade later, even as President Trump tries to, quote, do a big number on Dodd-Frank, quote, end quote, our banks are healthier than ever, having raised more than $750 billion in capital. And the numbers show that these healthy banks are using that capital to lend. And now, S2215, which is being jammed through the House, would roll back, I'm sorry, that's S2255, would roll back the clock on all of that progress just to help President Trump make good on his promise to his friends on Wall Street. S2255 is a mega bank giveaway masquerading as a community bank bill that will also undermine our efforts to curtail predatory and discriminatory lending practice. I, along with my fellow Democrats, support providing relief for community banks and credit unions and have advanced targeted legislation to provide that relief in the past, including a few of the provisions in this bill. But those provisions should advance on their own and not be held hostage to the dangerous and short-sighted demands of the big banks on Wall Street. Now, I remember the financial crisis, as do many of you. But when things are going well, and make no mistake, Wall Street is doing very well right now, people tend to have short memories, and they ignore the warning signs. But let me point out that just as CFTC Chairman Brooksley Born warned Congress that deregulating derivatives as part of Graham-Leach-Bliley would lead to a financial crisis, the Congressional Budget Office is now warning Congress that S 2155 will increase the risk of bank failures, including at the megabanks. Let me be clear on this point. The nonpartisan CBO is warning us that this bill will cause more banks to fail, so that's just one reason to oppose this bill. But there are first Section 104 of S 2155 that would allow 85% of depository institutions to avoid publicly reporting Critical Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, that is HMDA, data about mortgage lending that helps regulators, civil rights attorneys, and researchers identify and combat discrimination against people of color and other protected classes. These new HMDA data include key underwriting factors such as credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, origination charges, discount points, and interest rates, all of which are already collected but not reported by banks. It is insulting that we are even considering adopting a provision like this after the Center for Investigative Reporting found modern-day redlining in 61 metropolitan areas in our country. Now is the time to strengthen protections against abusive and unfair lending and not undo them as S 2155 recklessly would. The banking industry will suggest that investigations like reveals are, quote, insufficient, and, quote, to dictate discriminatory practices because it lacks data. But that's incredible. What's incredible is that this is the very same data, like credit history or loan-to-value data, that S 2155 seeks to keep out of the public's hands. The HMDA rollback is just one of the many provisions that has outraged civil rights, fair housing, consumer, and community organizations. Second, the bill eliminates licensing, compensation, and other sensible requirements for manufactured home retailers like Clayton Homes, which dominates the market and traps low-income and vulnerable borrowers in costly loans for manufactured homes, which can quickly lose value. Now, I'm pleased to see that the authorities have finally heeded my call to investigate Clayton Homes for its deceptive and predatory practices. But it's clear that the rules around predatory companies like Clayton Homes need to be strengthened, yet this bill does the exact opposite. Yes, there's a provision tucked into this bill to give manufactured housing lenders, and let's be clear, Clayton Homes is the manufactured housing industry, a free pass from many consumer protection rules. Third, the bill, despite claims that it is a bill for community banks, provides tremendous deregulation for the nation's largest banks. For example, Title IV of the bill rolls back critical stress testing requirements for globally systemic important banks like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and even bad actor Wells Fargo. It also allows many of the largest banks to escape critical oversight and prudential standards like tougher capital, liquidity, leverage stress testing, and living will requirements by raising the threshold of a bank that poses a systemic risk to the economy to $250 billion. Countrywide, National City, and GMAC, which all threatened U.S. financial stability in 2008, were the same size as the banks that would now escape as enhanced oversight under this bill. Furthermore, according to CBO, the bill could allow megabanks like J.P. Morgan Chase and Citigroup to benefit from modified capital requirements intended only for custody banks like State Street. Senator Bob Corker was so concerned about this provision that he tried to amend it, but Republican leadership blocked any effort to consider amendments, just as we are doing here today. So this is not a community bank bill, Mr. Chairman. In fact, the 38 largest banks that operate in the United States, which hold a combined $31.9 trillion in assets, including foreign banks like Deutsche Bank with vast U.S. operations, will receive substantial relief through S 2155. And experts have explained how this bill will accelerate industry consolidation, leading to fewer community banks, not more. And finally, I'd like to point out that this bill does nothing for consumers. In fact, the so-called consumer provisions that have been included in this bill are all opposed by consumer groups because they are harshly anti-consumer. We all remember how Equifax, through its own negligence, exposed the personal data of 148 million Americans, half of our population. But this bill does nothing to rein in Equifax. It actually rewards Equifax by telling the Federal Housing Finance Agency to use a credit scoring method that favors Equifax. And the bill eliminates the right of our active duty service members to sue Equifax and other credit bureaus if the bureaus fail to provide free credit monitoring or notify them of scams involving their data. And most troubling, the bill preempts state security freeze laws for these big three credit bureaus, even when states offer stronger protections for consumers when their data is compromised. Mr. Chairman, I'm also alarmed by how undemocratic the consideration of this bill has been. Under Democratic leadership, the House considered 321 amendments and adopted 207 of those in committee and on the floor when Congress considered Dodd-Frank. We then convened a transparent and televised conference committee for Dodd-Frank, during which 51 Republican amendments were accepted, despite the fact that Republicans were in the minority in both chambers. This pales in comparison to S. 2155. While senators filed 111 amendments in committee and another 163 on the floor, only 2 Senate amendments were adopted, both Republican managers' amendments that added more toxic provisions. And I'm concerned that this committee may follow suit, denying Democrats the ability to offer amendments, all so that Republicans can quickly rubber stamp this bill and send it straight to the president's desk. Mr. Chairman, I implore this House to not only heed my words of caution, but the pleas of hundreds of consumer civil rights veterans, religious, and labor groups, and the wide community of experts who all strongly oppose S. 2155. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Yeah, I thank the ranking member for her testimony. I feel like she and Chairman Hensterling and the Rules Committee were becoming fast friends there. You all have been up here so often this year, as to your point, we tried to deal with some things one line item at the time instead of one giant bill at the time, though lest anybody think this is the giant 2155. This is the giant 2155, which is smaller by comparison. I have visited with many financial institutions back home that have been concerned we were going to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Certainly, as we heard in your testimony, there are things in this bill you wish we had not have done. There are things that are not in this bill I wish were in this bill. And I have heard from community bank after community bank, credit union after credit union, saying, please don't let that perfect be the enemy of the good. I share your frustration with the Senate process, but we are where we are today. I will point out to my colleagues, since this has been such a topic of conversation, it was back in the middle of March that this bill passed the Senate. So I far from rushing this to the floor. The conversations I've had with members across the state of Georgia, where they were worried it was never going to make it to the floor at all. We were walking it so slow here, but I know you all have talked about each and every line of this over and over and over again in your committee, so I won't belabor those points. I'll ask the gentleman from Oklahoma if he has any questions.
Just quickly, I want to ask my friend from the great state of Missouri. In the Senate, if I'm correct, this was a very bipartisan bill. There were 16 Democrats, I believe, that voted for it. Is that right?
Actually, 17.
17? Mm-hmm. So
67-33.
Suggests there was a great deal of work across the aisle there. I don't have a lot of questions. I will tell you, literally getting on the plane yesterday to come back up here, I ran into one of my small town bankers and said, please, are you guys going to pass S. 2155? And I assured him that I thought we would. And I want to congratulate you on this. I actually thought our House product was superior, quite frankly, with all due respect to the Senate. But I think it is important to get something done. And in my communities, we don't have Wall Street banks. And I don't know a single banker or a single credit union that is not in favor of what is being done in this legislation. And to the point you made, in your presentation, Dodd-Frank was such a great thing. How come we're losing community banks left and right? fewer and fewer of the people that I represent are getting the financial services that they need, whether it's free checking or mortgage lending. We've got more and more banks getting out of that. So to try and get rid of some of this regulation that frankly has done more damage to people that had nothing to do with the financial crisis. In a sense, it's almost perverse because the people that did have gotten effectively bigger and stronger as a result of the legislation that was supposed to rein them in. So this is, in my view, something, a piece of legislation much overdue. I hope you follow it. I thought, again, your committee has produced some wonderful legislation. I understand that you're going to put together a package, hopefully send over to the Senate, give them an opportunity to enact many of the bipartisan things that you've done. And I think that would do a lot to strengthen, this bill, frankly, with a companion piece of legislation. So I hope that happens. But I want to commend both of you. It's always good to have both of you here. But this is a really important piece of legislation. I probably have, at least from my community bankers, have heard more about this than any single piece of legislation we've considered this year. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of inquiries at every town hall. When is this going to be done? And from our small business people who are finding it increasingly difficult to get credit from the local financial institutions that they're used to working with. So just want to thank you for bringing the bill before us. Look forward to supporting it on the House floor.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you. Mr. Lukemeyer, it probably won't surprise you that I agree more with Maxine Waters on this issue than I do with you. But this is the Rules Committee, and so among the things that we do up here is decide whether or not individual members will have an opportunity to be heard on the House floor. And you mentioned in your testimony, if I heard it correctly, that you called for an appropriate rule to be granted. I think that's correct. Yeah. Can you tell me what you think an appropriate rule might be? Because we've got at least 4 amendments have been submitted so far. I think there was no amendment deadline, so that I would expect there to be some more amendments coming. One of them I just saw that appeals to me, Mr. Pocan, is an amendment that would ensure that banks that have outsourced more than 50 jobs in any of the last 5 years remain subject to stricter federal oversight. I mean, I don't really want to see all these jobs outsourced overseas. But are you open to this committee allowing amendments, or are you?
Congressman, I personally don't have a problem with that, but I think the problem is this. The Senate has a very tenuous agreement to be able to put the bill together. And we have been told, and we have lots of our own bills, and this is why, as Mr. Cole alluded to, we're trying to put together another package of bills that we can send over there that would be a package of bills that are non-controversial, many of which the ranking members support yourself from our committee, that would enhance the ability of this bill to do more, and things that are not controversial. We don't want to kill the bill. We want to make it better. But yet we're told that this is, the agreement at this point is very tenuous, and if we put something on it, it has to go back to the Senate. And they don't want to have to take another vote on it. They would rather take a package of our bills. So I would ask you if you'd be willing to put any of the amendments, any other suggestions, and let's put it in another package and see if we can put that over, take that over there. Yeah, because that would, I think this is the process.
It doesn't really work well for me. I'll tell you why, because I hear that a lot on a lot of bills as an excuse to close things up, and there's a pattern here where this place has become very closed. And it's not just Democratic amendments being shut out; it's Republican amendments as well. And I appreciate that spin, but I hope that this won't be another closed rule, and that those who have offered amendments up to this point might get some consideration, and there may be some more amendments coming. But I appreciate you both being here, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas. Gentleman from Florida.
Whether or not this measure will have an effect on discrimination in home lending.
I'm sorry, would you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I was asking your assessment of how this impacts discrimination in home lending.
Well, let me just say, Mr. Hastings, that even Mr. Corker and some of the others had some second thoughts about the way that these major institutions were being allowed in this bill not to have to report HMDA data. And it's extremely important that we get this data. I said in my testimony that there is now another big move on for redlining that has been discovered and disclosed. So we need the information to understand exactly what these big banks are doing, because the HMDA data include underwriting factors such as credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, origination charges, discount prices, points rather, and interest rates, all of which are already collected but not reported by the banks. And one of the things we discovered when we had the big meltdown in 2008 was that there were many minorities who qualified for loans. Their income, their credit histories, they were all such that they should have been provided loans at the same interest rates, for example, that others were getting. But they were denied because it was plain old discrimination. We have to understand what the banks are doing, and this is what the HMDA data would allow us to do.
Furthering my questioning of you, Ms. Waters, the measure as offered seems to help community banks and credit unions, and at the very same time help the big banks that used to be too big to fail. My question, I guess, is could it have been written in a way that would have been able to help the community banks and the credit unions without the big giveaway to Wall Street?
Absolutely. First of all, I think it is important to say that our community banks are not suffering. They're doing very well. And yes, there's still some things that perhaps they would like to have done, and we have support from both sides of the aisle to do everything we can possibly do for community banks. What the big banks do is they tie any concerns that the community banks have to their wants and their desires. And so they keep them hooked together so that if we basically approve legislation based on perhaps something that the community banks would want, then the big banks would be advantaged from it. They won't separate. And I am hopeful that as we continue to work on these issues, that we can get the big banks to stop connecting the community banks to their desires and their wants, and let the community banks advocate on their own. Let us consider their concerns on their own. Let us do everything that we can, because we support community banks, but we cannot allow the big banks to misuse the community banks and come in here with them connected and get everything that they would like to have.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include a list of those and their expressions of concern that oppose this measure, and also, since I heard from bankers and community banks and credit unions, to include those who support the measure. If I may, and it's a long list, so without going into it, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the opposition and support for this measure.
Without objection, those materials will be included.
All right, and then finally, I'd ask you, Mr. Lukemeyer, to express your feelings with reference to whether or not there will be fiscal effects to the extent that the deficit would be increased, and it may require a waiver for this matter to go forward.
I don't believe that there is a fiscal note on the bill that is negative. I think it will have a positive effect from the standpoint that you're enabling the businesses and the citizens to grow the economy. The regulatory relief that's going to take place here allows the banking community, including the credit unions and other financial institutions, to be able to provide, to be able to, number one, stay in business, so you continue to loan to people and businesses. You know, and I'll give you an example. I know we were just discussing the HMDA rules. Within those HMDA rules, for instance, is an ability of the community banks to be less burdened. The big banks are still burdened with all of the HMDA rules. This takes place only on the smaller banks, and it only backs off on what CFPB put in with the 25 data points back in 2015. So it's this sort of regulatory approach that is costing the banks to the point where they're going out of business one a day. The credit unions one a day, and so this consolidation is a restricting of credit. It's costing consumers money. You know, 75% of the people had free checking before Dodd-Frank. Now it's down to 37%. The Fed's own study shows 13% less small businesses have access to credit today than what they did prior to Dodd-Frank. So when you start looking at all these things, I think this is going to have a very positive effect. I mean, the name of the bill is economic growth, regulatory relief, and consumer protection.
It has a nice name, Mr.
So
Lukemeyer,
I think
if I could just reclaim my
Sure.
time to put to you, the CBO report reflects that it would, estimates that enacting the bill will increase federal deficits by $671 million over the 2018 to 2027 period. And without going further into it, they estimate that assuming appropriation of the necessary amounts implementing the bill will cost $77 million over that same period of time. Now, I heard everything that you said, but I'm curious to your response with reference to the CBO report.
Well, Congressman, the way CBO scores things is baffling to me. We had a bill last year that actually allowed less regulation and less by a regulatory agency, less work by a regulatory agency, and it still cost more money. I never could figure that out. They could never give us an example of how that figured. So I can't tell you how they came up with those figures, other than the fact that I believe that when you empower the people and the businesses of this country through allowing the financial institutions to be able to give them the loans and provide them the services they need at a cost that they can afford, you'll see a dynamism to our economy that is going to grow well beyond whatever the thing CBO says this thing scores.
Right. You know, well, I've been cognizant of several things that the majority party suggests are going to happen, and they don't happen. But in this particular instance, the concern that we have is that Wall Street banks are already making record profits. And when it comes right down to it, let's use one of the banks that I bank with. Bank of America made a profit of $6.9 billion, and the biggest quarterly profit in the bank's history. So what the hell do they need any input from us about how to do their business? They seem to be doing pretty good. I appreciate your answer, but I think all of us rely upon the Congressional Budget Office and the fact that it is ostensibly not supposed to be a partisan measure. I suspect that if Democrats were offering a measure that would increase, according to CBO, a $671 billion deficit, that Republicans would go bonkers. You know, and I'm beginning to believe that you all are no longer adherents to your fiscal conservative notions in this country, because it seems that there's an attitude out there of deficits be damned, let's just roll. You know, I'm concerned about that. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just delighted to have a bipartisan bill before the Rules Committee. too often we have bills that are purely partisan, and it's just kind of nice to have something that a significant number of Democrats and a significant number of Republicans, not all on each side, but a significant number, support. This is not the bill we passed out of the House. It doesn't contain a lot of the provisions that I would like to see in the bill, but this is the bipartisan bill that passed the Senate. Obviously, the Senate has its own issues in trying to pass things, particularly of this magnitude. And I think this says a lot for all of us that we're able to work together on something of this bipartisan nature. I'm like Mr. Cole, I don't have big banks in my district. I've got a lot of community banks. And even when I was running for Congress, I heard from them over and over again ever since of how the Dodd-Frank law and the way it's been implemented is actually hurting them in doing the things that they want to do to help small businesses and in some cases in my district, farmers, recover from the recession. So I just got to say, for those two reasons, I think this is a splendid example of where Congress came together in a bipartisan fashion to respond to real problems in a way that makes sense for the American people. So I'm pleased with the bill. I would have gone further, but I get it. I don't always get my way. That's the way democracy works. And I'm glad to have this before us. I'm looking forward to voting for the rule on it. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Alabama. The gentlelady from California. No questions. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I have no questions.
Gentleman from Colorado.
No questions.
Gentlelady from Wyoming. Well, thank you both again for being here today. If you would leave the anything you have in writing for our stenographer, we'll make sure that becomes a part of the record. And this concludes our panel on 2155.
This is what you need.
I see Mr. Pallone from New Jersey here. If you would come and take a seat at the table. Mr. Pallone, I see the senior member from the state of Texas here, Mr. Barton.
I was getting bigger, Mr. Chairman.
These are not amendments, Mr. Pallone, that folks have to make your bill better. These are amendments to make NDAA better. So you just know that
That's one
you
bill.
receive less scrutiny.
Well, our bill,
I will-
we're easy, Mr. Chairman.
Yes. I will advise both of our witnesses that anything you have in writing, if you will submit that for the record, we will make sure it becomes a part of the record, and we would welcome any oral comments that you wish to make. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the Rules Committee, Republican and Democratic side. I'm here on behalf of Chairman Walden and Chairman Burgess to encourage a rule for...
The gentleman will suspend. Is the green light on there on your microphone?
It is. Am I
can't
not?
see it from here.
I'm not projecting, I guess.
Thank you very much.
Is that better? Okay. I'm sorry. Texans are soft-spoken and low-key.
Modest.
We are modest, yes, with a straight face. Anyway, I'm here on behalf of Chairman Walden and Chairman Burgess to encourage a rule for S-204, the Senate bill that passed unanimously. We had passed a congressional bill very similar to this, 259 to 140 back in March, but the Senate chose not to take it up, and so we're now asking that we bring the Senate version of our House bill to the floor. This is, we call it the right to try, and it's pretty straightforward. My brother, who died of liver cancer back in 2000, had exhausted all conventional treatment options, chemotherapy and radiation, and there was an experimental drug at the time that was showing some positive effects. His doctors petitioned the FDA, and he was allowed to try it. And I also encouraged I called the commissioner and encouraged them to let my brother try it. And they were told at the time that it would either really help him or it would accelerate the disease. And in John's case, it accelerated the disease. But we were informed of the chances and the potential, and my brother was totally conscious. I mean, he was still in control of his faculties. My mother was still alive at the time. Myself and my other brother and sister, we all agreed that we should do it, or that John should do it, and he was in good spirits. Unfortunately, it didn't work for him. But if we had to do it over again, we'd do it over again. He literally had no other his doctors, at the time he chose this option, said he had probably a month to live, maybe 2 months. If it had worked, he might be here today, but it didn't. And so this bill would guarantee. Now, at that time, it was FDA discretion, and the FDA did accept it. They let him try. This bill, the FDA would have to be informed, but they could not deny if the patient has given informed consent and the doctor has told the patient all the risk associated with it. I see no downside to it. I see only an upside. I mean, I know probably Dr. Burgess has had similar situations. When you're told point blank that you or your family member close to you, there's nothing else that can be done. And doctors hate to tell people that. But when you're told that, this would give them one last chance at hope. And it wouldn't help all the time, but the fact that you still have a chance, I think is worth codifying. And so I would ask that the Rules Committee report this bill and let the House vote its will. It passed, the House version passed again in March, and so I don't see any reason that this one won't pass overwhelmingly if you report a rule that puts it on the floor. So, thank you for your consideration.
Gentleman yields back.
I yield back. That's the correct term. You'd think I know that. The gentleman yields. I don't know that I'm a gentleman, but I do yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
He is a gentleman, by the way.
Thank you.
More
for
than
that
a gentleman.
stipulation.
But as Mr. Barton mentioned, we were here before on the House version, which I oppose, and I'd like to explain briefly why. But I wanted to also say that the Senate version, in my opinion, is worse. In other words, I'm even more concerned about the Senate version than I am about the House version, because I think there were certain protections in the House version that you don't see in the Senate version. The reason I think this bill, I oppose the bill, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, is because I don't think it's necessary. In other words, the FDA has a process now called the expanded access process, if you will, whereby if someone has a life-threatening disease, is an extremist, whatever the word is, that they can apply to the FDA, and in 99% of the cases, it's approved. In some cases, the FDA puts additional safeguards before they approve it. And that process is working. The FDA has physicians available 24 hours a day to approve on an emergency basis these treatments. If it's not an emergency, it usually takes no more than 4 days for approval. And when there's a denial, it's not from the FDA, it's from the pharmaceutical company that decides that they don't want to give it to you, and they don't have to, and nothing would change that under current law or with the FDA. So my basic point is it's not necessary. We have a process, and I don't think it's a good idea to take the FDA out, because if you do, then that oversight or those safeguards that they might put in play before they grant the approval disappear, because as Mr. Barton mentioned, they simply have to be notified. They don't have to approve it anymore. I know that when we had this bill on the floor, some members mentioned to me that over 40 states have right-to-try laws, and so members said to me, well, my state has it, so what's the difference? But the bottom line is that to my knowledge, nobody has gotten approval through a right-to-try law at a state level that hasn't had approval through the FDA. So it's just not necessary, is the bottom line. And I also want to say there's no guarantee of coverage. There's no guarantee of insurance coverage. There's no guarantee, of course, that the pharmaceutical has to give it to you. I also want to mention, again, that, and I said this last time, this is all from last time, but I'll eventually quickly get to the Senate bill. There was no regular order here, and I know you worry about that. We did not have a markup on this bill, even on the House version, and now the Senate version came over. We haven't had a hearing on the Senate bill or markup on the Senate bill. The problem is that I think the impression is being given, well, what is the difference if somebody gets this drug and they don't have to get FDA approval, and I don't even want to talk about, I'm not going to mention you, Joe, because I understand your situation with your relative, and I don't want to get into that. But the problem is that if you don't have the FDA involved, right, what basically the bill says is that as long as the procedure went through part one, or phase one of a clinical trial. The problem is that phase one only deals with toxicity. So that doesn't mean that there's been any proven effectiveness or even any real serious look at any side effects that might occur. And so it is possible that someone actually takes one of these drugs and ends up, dying earlier or having a more harmful or awful death. So it's difficult, Mr. Chairman, to talk about this, but I just wanted to mention a few those things. Now, getting to the Senate bill, I wanted to enter into the record, if I could, a letter from 104 different patient advocacy groups that oppose the bill. And I just wanted to read one paragraph from that letter, if I could, Mr. Chairman. And it says, on March 21st, the House passed a version of the Right to Try Act that incorporated important patient safeguards, such as more robust informed consent and public reporting requirements, additional FDA oversight, and a narrower definition of eligibility for this pathway. The Senate version does not include these safeguards, and therefore could greatly increase the likelihood of our patients being harmed by unsafe and ineffective experimental therapies. Therefore, this version is substantially worse for patients. And I know you probably say, well, you talked about why this was so bad last time, how much worse than the Senate bill be. Well, that's what I just wanted to detail a little bit.
Without objection, that letter will be made a copy.
Thank you. So let me just point to a few ways which I think the Senate bill is worse. One of them was in a statement that Commissioner Gottlieb, the FDA commissioner, made before the committee well, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't before the committee, but he made this statement that he said that the Senate bill is not limited to patients with terminal illness. And this is a quote, "We are certainly going to be exposing patients with potentially less severe conditions to a risk." So one of the problems with the Senate bill over the House bill is that the House bill clearly was people who had a terminal illness. But that's not true for the Senate bill. You could have severe diabetes, chronic heart failure, and other things that were not necessarily terminal, and you would be able to have access under this bill. At least that's the way I read it, and that's the way Commissioner Gottlieb read it. The other thing is that the Senate bill has loopholes that basically allows, and this isn't in the House bill, that allows like suppliers or supply chain partners of these experimental treatments to evade regulatory requirements like labeling products as investigational or restrictions on promotion and commercialization of some treatments. So essentially, under the old bill, under the House bill, you couldn't do this kind of promotion, and you had to do certain labeling that's saying that it was investigational, that we don't have in the Senate bill. So that's another reason that it's worse. The other thing is that, the bill prevents the FDA from taking enforcement actions against manufacturers and others for violations under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So the FDA wouldn't have the ability to ensure compliance with good manufacturing products or intentional adulteration. See, if I could just sum up, my problem is this. I think that under the existing law, if a manufacturer, which is a good actor, has something that maybe has only gone through phase one, but they think might be helpful in some way, and you're willing to take the risk, as Mr. Barton said, then then that manufacturer will say, okay, we'll go to the FDA, we'll get approval in this instance, and you can have the drug. But I don't think that I think what you're going to have here with this bill are the bad actors. In other words, the good actors, the J&J, the Bristol Myers, the companies that might have this drug that they think they'll give it a try, they're not going to take that risk without the FDA approval because they want the FDA approval through this exceptional process. So I think the only thing that's left might be a bad actor, some unscrupulous manufacturer, fly-by-night outfit that's going to promote something like snake oil and say, well, we don't care whether the FDA approves it or not. We don't care about the liability. We're just going to sell it to you. And that's why I think that this Senate bill is even worse, because I think it even makes it more likely that that bad actor, snake oil type, is issuing and promoting some kind of a drug to unsuspecting people. I thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I appreciate both of your testimony. The committee does. So often we have conversations here in the Rules Committee about just going through the motions for bills that are not going anywhere at all. I have the Statement of Administration policy on S-204 that says if the S-204 were presented to the President in its current form, his advisors would recommend that he sign the bill into law. So this is
That's a good point, Mr. Chairman. If this bill passes the House, the President will sign it. It's already passed the Senate by unanimous consent. So it's
next stop, President's desk after House floor. Thank you both for your testimony. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Just a quick question to my friend from New Jersey, although my friend from Texas may have answered it. I was going to ask you what the vote was in the Senate. This was unanimous consent?
Unanimous consent. Yeah, this bill was unanimous consent passed, and the House bill, the Minority Leader, Mr. Schumer, has put a block on it.
Is there no particular reason why my friend from New Jersey would know why, but I know you didn't support the House bill, but if it was better, at least, do you have any idea why a block was put on it?
I mean, again, I'm just guessing, but my understanding, your chairman is right. I mean, the president has really highlighted this. He highlighted it in his State of the Union address. He highlighted it last week when he announced his plan to try to bring down the price of drugs. So I think my feeling is they just figure that, we'll send the Senate bill to the House will pass it and it'll go to his desk, whereas if you go to the Senate and you send the House bill, you need 60 votes, and the likelihood of going to conference, we don't go to conference anymore. It's very little. So if the House passes it, the president signs it, and he gets his wish. But I just think that, see, the problem is, I know you're going to say, well, so many people support this, but I think they support it because they don't think it does any harm. They figure, oh, these states have it, the FDA has a process, so what's the difference? But there is a difference in the sense that the FDA doesn't get involved, and then I think you get these unscrupulous people that you would not get now.
I want to, I want to first of all say, on one point, I agree with the gentleman from New Jersey. The House bill is better. It's got better liability protection. It's got a tighter definition. So in a perfect world, I'd say the House bill. But this isn't a perfect world. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. This bill is a good bill. It will become law. And Mr. Pallone's, I really listened to what he said because he really studies these issues. The problem I think he has, the biggest problem, he said something to the effect that you don't have to be terminally ill. Well, let me read the definition in the Senate bill. For purposes of this section, the term eligible patient means a patient who has been diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or condition as identified in Section 312.81 of Title 21 Code of Federal Register, who has exhausted approved treatment options and is unable to participate in a clinical trial involving the eligible investigational drugs. Now, I don't know the difference between life-threatening and terminally ill. Maybe Dr. Burgess knows. But under this, there's... Yeah, they're both... And they're no more conventional treatment options under this bill. So, and to go through stage 1 clinical trials, it's not Tom Cole and Joe Barton meeting at the Red River and mixing up a batch of snake oil and selling it. You've put quite a few millions of dollars to go through stage 1 clinical trials, and you've proven that the drug is not harmful. And the whole point of the clinical of the trial is to see if it has any efficacy, if it has any positive benefit. So they're not telling the patient, and in my brother's case, they didn't say this is a guarantee. They said it's got really good results so far, but in some people it accelerates your condition, which in my brother's case was liver cancer. So again, this is not a perfect bill. The House bill is better, but this bill will become law, and it does help to the extent that it gives them some hope. And even though the FDA normally approves almost every request, you don't have to go through the FDA to get approval, but you also, it blocks, if this bill becomes law, it blocks the drug manufacturer from not giving you the drug.
No.
So it is better than current law. It really is.
I appreciate that.
If I could, I could explain what my criticism was to the issue that Mr. Barton is mentioning. This is from the technical assistance, I guess, that was given to us by HHS on the bill, on the Senate bill. And it says, while the bill's stated title and purpose is to provide terminally ill patients with access to unapproved products, S204 provides eligibility to a much broader range of patients diagnosed with a life-threatening disease or condition. The term life-threatening disease or condition could include chronic and often manageable diseases. Diabetes, for example, can become life-threatening, but can often be well controlled in patients through diet, exercise, and medication. If all patients with diabetes and other chronic but manageable illness were eligible, it could greatly expand the scope of the legislation well beyond what we understood to be its original intent and beyond the scope of most state right-to-try laws and FDA's expanded access program. So, again, I
take the gentleman's point, and I just offer the observation that HHS will be advising the president, so they can make their point there. But on one unrelated note, and I'll turn back, on one occasion, my friend Mr. Barton and I noticed that we think we have the last 2 BlackBerries in the United States
I have
Congress.
mine on my desk, but it's
And
not
I
functional.
must tell you, you may be the last one because my staff is forcing me to surrender this week. I think that it runs out this month or something, that they don't support it. So if you can
Mine's
just
still on
hang
my
on
desk.
past the end of the week, you will be the last holder.
No, sir.
And yours, rather than mine, will end up in the Smithsonian.
No, you've got mine's still on the desk, but they switched me over a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, well, then I do maybe have the very last one.
At least
I'll
on,
go home and talk to my staff and say I want it extended.
is that still usable?
Yes, it's still usable. Still
See,
working.
then you do, because mine, I still have it. I haven't given it up, but it's not functional anymore.
With that, I'll yield. But it just probably undercuts our credibility testifying on anything technical at all. So, but Mr. Pallone's kind enough not to exploit the situation.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you. While I appreciate the fact that the president said he will sign this bill, in all candor, I don't regard this president as a master of detail. He's a master of sound bites, but not necessarily detail. And for the life of me, again, it goes back to a complaint I had with the previous bill. We just kind of throw regular order to the side, and there may be some. I think we all want to make sure that people get as many options as they possibly can if they're terminally ill. But there are legitimate questions, and Mr. Pallone raised a few of them. And maybe if we did a hearing in the House, we could have had HHS up here or other experts up here to talk about maybe that the language is drawn too broadly. Maybe we could have narrowed it down. Maybe we got a tweak here and a tweak there. It's just like we're always saying, we're going to move things to the floor under closed processes and do away with hearings. They're flawed, but it's better than nothing. Why don't we strive to have the most perfect bill we can come out of this place? may not be perfect, but as perfect as we can make it. And all these other issues that are being raised here, they're legitimate. I mean, and rather than brush them aside, maybe we ought to just deal with them. But that's not the case here. And so I appreciate the sentiment behind this bill, but there are, and I'm just frustrated that this could have been better if we had a better process. Mr. Plone?
Well, I'm glad you said what you said, and I think it particularly applies in this case because I don't really think there's any evidence that anybody's not getting these drugs or this treatment because of the existing law. In other words, we have this expanded access process with the FDA, and it works in almost every case. So I think that you're particularly right when you say, why are we changing it? You know, who's really going to be, who's going to have access that doesn't have access now? So we may be doing a lot of damage.
I would just say I think this conversation would be better had in your committee rather than in this committee. But that's not the case, so I'll yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chairman of the Health Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
From Texas.
Now, just for clarification, I recall a hearing where Dr. Gottlieb testified for the administration or for the agency, and then we had a stakeholders panel that followed. Most of the stakeholders that testified were actually in favor of the Senate-passed bill.
On this bill?
Of the Senate-passed bill.
On the issue.
The Senate bill had already passed.
In the House?
The time is mine.
In the House?
The Senate, the United States House of Representatives, the Committee on Energy and Commerce,
Did he hear
2123 is the
on this
room
bill?
number. The Senate bill was part of the bill that was noticed. Now, many of us on the committee thought that there might be some better ideas. Dr. Gottlieb thought there might be some better ideas. So we brought that bill to the House floor. It passed, as Mr. Barton points out, with a pretty sizable majority. It wasn't enough to pass on suspension, but it passed under a rule. And then it went back over to the Senate, and they said, no, the Senate bill is the only one you can, that's the one we voted for, that's the one you've got to pass. So I mean, yeah, I prefer the House bill. I think it was a better product, but I think it is preferable to pass this bill than doing nothing at all, because I know we heard from the patients on that panel, the stakeholders on that panel, particularly the young man with ALS was pretty outspoken about why he thought that he needed the ability to go to a therapy that would ease his suffering and prolong his life. Goodness knows I hear from parents with kids with muscular dystrophy at home all the time about lack of access to compounds or treatments that they think will help their children if their kid has been in a clinical trial, and the clinical trial is now over, and the FDA has said, well, we don't think it really helped enough, and the parent says, but my kid was so much better. Why shouldn't they have the ability to use that? So that's really what we're saying with this. I preferred the House's approach. I preferred the committee's approach. I think the committee staff did an excellent job in bringing this along and getting us to a point where Dr. Gottlieb was comfortable and the committee was comfortable, but unfortunately the Senate wasn't. The Senate wasn't, and the president has said, I want to do something for these patients. It's a compelling group of patients. They've made their case to the president. They've made their case to the vice president. They want action on this. The fact of the matter is, we pass this bill on the floor of the House tomorrow, and it goes down to be signed before the end of the week. People want to see that. So, Mr. Barton, thank you for...
yield a minute?
Absolutely.
I mean, look, a couple things. First of all, we on our committee have this process where a lot of times we don't necessarily even have a hearing, but we meet with stakeholders and we have roundtables and we discuss some of these issues. I'm not suggesting we haven't discussed this issue, but I do think that it's true that there was never a hearing on the bill, either bill.
Reclaiming my time, I remember it differently.
And there wasn't a markup in any
I remember
case.
a hearing on, yes, our product and this bill, because this bill was what was under discussion.
But I don't want to argue. There wasn't a markup. There may have been a hearing in a larger sense. But I also don't, I distinctly remember that the case that you were talking about was not, with the individual, was not a case where he said that he wasn't able to access or to use the expanded FDA access process. See, so my point is, I'm not saying that there aren't circumstances where you go through phase one and a person should be able to get this. I'm saying that we don't know of any case where they were denied or where they were actually, or if they were told maybe they had to do some changes and they ultimately got the drug or the treatment. So that's my point. I don't see why this is necessary. That's my point. I'm not saying that there aren't these cases, but they normally go through the FDA process. They get approval. They may have to change something here or there. But why do we need a bill? Why do we need to change the existing law?
Again, we may be remembering the hearing differently, but there was a problem with access, and this is a problem that the president said he's going to solve. So
I don't remember that, Dr. Burgess.
I
really don't remember anybody saying, including the case you brought, that they were denied by the FDA in the expanded access process. I don't remember that. So.
Well, there was a case where...
Well, the person made the case that they would rather that they didn't have to go through the FDA process, but I don't think they said they weren't able to get it.
Well,
Either
will you yield or you yield? I mean, y'all are both right. The FDA rarely says no. But on the other hand, the FDA is not out of the process because they've already approved the clinical trial. They've already certified the successful completion of phase one of the clinical trial. They have to be informed of the outcome if an investigational drug is allowed to be used. So the FDA isn't being short-circuited, but it does give certainty that if the patient wants to try something that hasn't yet been approved, and the doctor wants to prescribe it, and the patient is written informed consent, it can be done. Now, that is an improvement over current law. It's not much, but it is an improvement. And there's no downside to it. There's no downside to this bill. You know, so I don't really see a reason to oppose it because it could help. It could be a little bit faster. It does give the patient a guaranteed right, which they don't currently have. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good outcome.
The downside to the bill is the House bill was a better product.
Well,
but we don't have,
I've already agreed with
Frank
on that.
we don't have the option of it's been opposed in the Senate, and this is the option. This is the pathway that is available to us, and it's a pathway I'm prepared to take today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Chairman yields back. My friend from Florida, Mr. Essex. Gentleman from Georgia. Gentleman from California. Gentleman from Alabama. No questions. Gentleman from Washington. I thank the two of you for being here today. We have agreed that even a bill that the House disagrees on is better than a bill that the Senate agrees on unanimously. And I'm grateful to you for making that bipartisan distinction.
I might make one final comment. It's the first time I don't come to the Rules Committee a lot, but it's the first time in a long time I've been here that Louise Slaughter wasn't here. And she was a good person, and I'm sure the committee knows what an advocate she was for the rule of law and all of that. So it's got a new member over here, and she'll do a great job, but I miss the gentlelady from New York not being here.
We all miss her. I'd say the gentleman from Texas, though we are advantaged by being able to see her on a regular basis, right here behind you on the wall. So we're never far from Louise, but that's very, very, very kind of you to recognize. With that longevity, this concludes the testimony on S-204. I announced incorrectly who would be here to discuss the largest of the bills before us. That's the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, and the gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis. If you all would please take the table. We removed the large stacks of amendments from the table, though we'll be happy to make them available to you again if you'd like to see them. Anything that you have in writing, we would be happy to make a part of the record. And Mr. Whitman, if you would make sure your microphone is on, we'd welcome any verbal testimony that you may have.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence and your time, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member McGovern for holding this hearing to provide for the consideration of H.R. 5515, the National Defense Authorization Act of fiscal year 2019. And I'm pleased and proud to be standing in today for Chairman Thornberry, and I'm pleased to be sitting here alongside also the acting ranking member, Mrs. Davis from the great state of California. You know, as always, great to be here working with her. And consistent with our tradition on the House Armed Services Committee, this is a bipartisan bill. It passed out of committee earlier this month on a 60-to-1 vote. This may be why the Armed Services Committee is virtually the only committee that still passes an annual authorization bill. And we have done this now for 57 years in a row, which we're very proud of. And in January of this year, the Secretary of Defense submitted the National Defense Strategy. And in announcing the submission of the NDS, Secretary Mattis stated, "Our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare, air, land, sea, space, and cyberspace, and it's continuing to erode. Rapid technological change, the negative impact on military readiness is resulting from the longest continuous stretch of combat in our nation's history and defense spending caps, because we've been operating also for 9 of the last 10 years under continuing resolutions that have created an overstretched and under-resourced military. We've all been troubled by the recent series of fatal military accidents, from the collisions of the USS John S. McCain and USS Fitzgerald in the Pacific last summer to the crash of a C-130 near Savannah last month. We all feel an obligation to turn this military readiness crisis around. H.R. 5515 was written with this reality in mind, and it complies fully with the recent 2-year budget agreement. It continues the rebuilding efforts Congress began last year, and it initiates new reforms to ensure the military is agile enough to protect the country. I'd like to talk to you about a few of the critical priorities in this bill. First of all, it supports necessary increase in top-line funding to support our troops and readiness recovery, consistent with President Trump's commitment to rebuild the military. Provides a pay raise of 2.6% for our troops, the largest in 9 years. Increases the size of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Navy, and Air Reserve, as well as the Air Guard. Makes major reforms in Pentagon bureaucracy and streamlining buying practices. Increases funding to rebuild our military and support readiness recovery. Increases funding for training in each of the service branches. $18.5 billion to begin to rehabilitate and replace worn-out Army equipment. $39.4 billion to begin to overcome the crisis in military aviation by getting more aircraft in the air. $36 billion to restore America's strength at sea. $23.3 billion to sustain, repair, and rebuild crumbling military buildings and other infrastructure. It also makes critical investments in missile defense and our nuclear deterrent, which is the cornerstone of our national security. Makes key investments in other critical military capabilities to confront aggression and address threats around the world, including threats from Russia, the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Authorizes funding for co-development and co-production of missile defense and weapons systems with our key ally, Israel, and advocates innovative technologies that will reform the way we fight and win wars. A few other salient details for you to consider. At the committee markup, there were 420 amendments filed. 317 were considered, 276 were adopted, and of those, 132 were from Democrat members, and 144 were offered by Republican members. This is truly a bipartisan bill. I remind you, it is required of us as members of Congress under Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a Navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of land and naval forces. I appreciate the vital role the Rules Committee plays bringing this important bill, a constitutional responsibility, to the full House for its consideration. And I thank you for your attention. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, if I could just extend Ranking Member Smith's apologies for not being here yet. He's in transit, and hopefully will be here shortly. On behalf of Ranking Member Smith and myself, I want to thank Chairman Thornberry and, of course, Mr. Whitman, Chairman of the Subcommittee of Sea Power, for another efficient, equitable, and well-executed committee process. As it was mentioned, as Mr. Whitman mentioned, this bill is the product of a bipartisan committee process that reflected priorities of all of our members and was approved overwhelmingly. There are still some issues of concern We know that no bill is perfect, and certainly this NDAA, which comes in every year, we could not say is always perfect, but we work very hard at it. We will work to improve it as it moves through this committee, the floor, and then conference. Thank you for your time today, and I'll try and answer any questions you may have that Mr. Whitman is not able to answer, but I have great confidence in him.
Yeah, I thank the gentlelady for her testimony. Mr. Whitman, you mentioned that it's been an ongoing bipartisan process year after year after year after year here in the House. My understanding is we can go back just as far and find that our Senate colleagues get their work done, and presidents of both parties put their signature on your work.
Yes.
In the spirit of things that sometimes are not the highest and best use of the Rules Committee's time. I put this category of things that will be of the highest and best use, and I'm grateful to you for bringing it. I'm told, I don't know if 420 amendments in committee was a record for you all, but I'm told we have so far received over 550 amendments, making it a record for us there. Perhaps your bipartisanship was not as well received as you thought, and we have lots of, we're going to try to polarize this bill before we're done. Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Just a couple of quick comments. I had the privilege of sitting on your committee for 6 years. We have two distinguished members of your committee here on the Rules Committee now, and it is genuinely a bipartisan product, and you're to be commended for working through and working together. Certainly I sit on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and I know how closely that Chairman Granger works with Chairman Thornton, and that too is a very bipartisan committee, and undoubtedly will with the appropriate time, produce a bipartisan appropriations process that lines up pretty smartly with the authorization work that you have done so well. So it's actually one of the areas that Congress works very well. Unfortunately, I would suspect the other parts of the appropriations bills will hold up the appropriations bill beyond what we should. I wish we could go ahead and move that through, but I think it'll be held hostage a little bit until we come to a broader agreement on the other areas. And that's, again, that's fair enough, but I think it'd be such a good signal to send the authorization, the appropriations bill together, before the September 30th deadline to the President's desk, and hope we can at least come close with that. So I just want to again thank you for what you've done, and this is a big change. I mean, the new defense strategy, the additional resources, which I know both of you fought very hard to make sure that our men and women in uniform received, and I think are really necessary going forward. You're to be commended for that too. So it's a good product, and I do wish the rest of Congress respected your work as much as I do. I'm not sure 500 amendments are totally necessary after your committee entertained over 400 and dealt with over 300 and adopted 280 some odd, or whatever the number was that Mr. Whitman mentioned. But I guess everybody's entitled to have an opinion, whether it's informed or not, so we'll struggle through it. And but I hope your committee weighs in very heavily on these amendments. You are the House experts on both sides of the aisle here. You do the hearings, you do the travel, you do the testimony, and I really listen very carefully to what the leadership of your committee has to say when these other amendments come up, and not inclined to support anything that does not, get the consent of the chairman and the ranking member, both of whom have produced a very bipartisan product, very thoughtfully, obviously with the help of their members on both sides. So with that, I'll yield back, but just again, thank you for your very, very good work.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, I want to thank you both for being here, and I agree. I mean, the process in the Armed Services Committee has always been historically bipartisan. Sometimes I don't always support the final product, but nonetheless, there's integrity in the process, and we appreciate that. And there are a lot of amendments that are being offered, as Mr. Cole and Mr. Woodall pointed out. I trust that a fair number of them will be made in order, as also been the pattern, although when it comes to my amendments, they always seem to be blocked. But we'll have to work that out here.
Did you say done on block?
Yeah, I wish they were done on block. I'd take them any which way, You can self-execute them. I don't care what But in any event, but I hope that some of the important issues that members have concerns about will be allowed to be debated on the floor. And again, I thank you for your work, and I have no questions. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia has no questions. The gentleman from Florida is recognized. Gentleman from Alabama. The gentleman from Colorado. No questions. The gentlelady from Wyoming. And the gentlelady from California. They will thank you both for being here as the stand-in chairman of the Rules Committee. I'll tell you, you did a wonderful job as a stand-in chairman of Armed Services. You did a wonderful job as a stand-in ranking member. I thank you.
I'm not as good-looking as the chairman, so anyway.
Does any other member wish to be heard on HR 5515? Seeing none, this concludes the hearing portion of the meeting. If I could advise my colleagues that the efficiency of your new chairman has stunned the staff, and if folks would stay with us for another 5 minutes or so, we should be ready to go very shortly. We will proceed before votes tonight. The hearing stands in recess, subject to call of the chair.
Read it as is? Yep. Let's go. Don't know what. They're in the building.
I feel the love on the committee, and I appreciate the committee's indulgence. But I'm feeling the camaraderie left and right, to say the gentleman from Florida. The chair will entertain a motion from the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 5515, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, a structured rule. The rule will provide 1 hour general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services. The rule weighs all points of order against the consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee grant 11570 shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule weighs all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule weighs all points of order against the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report and amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of the rule. The rule provides that the amendments printed in the report may be offered only in the order printed by the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, and shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for a time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand of division of the question. The rule weighs all points of order against the amendments printed in the report or against the amendments en bloc as described in Section 3 of this rule. Section 3 of the rule provides that the chairman of the Committee on Armed Services or his designee may offer amendments en bloc consisting of amendments printed in the report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chairman and ranking minority member of the Committee on Armed Services or their designees. Shall not be subject to an amendment and shall not be subject to a demand or the division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. Section 4 of the rule provides that no further consideration of the bill shall be in order except pursuant to a subsequent order of the House. Section 5 of the rule provides for consideration of S-204 for Trickett, Wendler, Frank Mangello, Jordan McLean, and Matthew Bellini, Right to Try Act of 2017, under a closed rule. The rule provides for 1 hour debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule weighs all points of order against the consideration of the bill. The rule weighs all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule provides for 1 motion to recommit. Section 6 of the rule provides for consideration of S2155, the Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides for 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Financial Services. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule weighs all points of order against consideration of the bill. The bill weighs all points of order against provisions in the bill, and the rule provides for 1 motion to recommit. Finally, Section 7 of the rule provides that the motion to reconsider to the vote on the question of passage of H.R. 2, Agriculture and Nutrition Act of 2018, may continue to be postponed through legislative day, Thursday, June 22nd, 2018.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from Colorado.
could I make a motion, please, to have that read in English so I could understand?
The committee's heard.
I withdraw the motion.
The committee's heard the motion from the gentleman from Georgia to a closed rule for S204 and S2155, a structured rule for HR 5515, making an order an initial tranche of 103 amendments. Is there any amendment or discussion? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Just a brief statement, then I'll have an amendment. Mr. Chairman, in a very short while, we're going to vote to report out this rule, and the committee will, once this passes, and I assume it will pass because you'll all vote for it, we'll have reached a very sad milestone. Tucked away inside this rule, which will be over our objections, the majority's 83rd and 84th closed rule. That's for this Congress. And with that, it will make the 115th Congress the most closed Congress ever in the history of the country. And the record you're breaking is your own. That record was set by Republicans back in 2014. And so it's like the majority is allergic to an open proposal. You know, we can't even offer an amendment to fix a typo under a closed rule, as the chairman knows, let alone offer something that would change people's lives. And this restrictive process has real-world implications. It's what has allowed the Republican majority to block votes on the House floor to protect the dreamers and strengthen our economy and lower the cost of prescription drugs and combat gun violence. The list can go on and on and on and on. You have blocked nearly 1,800 amendments from Republicans and Democrats this Congress, and it's only May. It's only May. The public is tired of the dysfunction around here. They may not realize it, but this closed process is what creates it. And it has led to brinkmanship and 2 government shutdowns. It's why this Congress is unable to deal with any of the major issues we face. You know, Speaker Ryan promised a more open process when he got the gavel, but that was clearly just spin because he's the only speaker in history that has never had a truly open rule. We're blocked from even having a simple debate. You guys have the votes. If you don't like something, you can vote against it. But instead, this House is practically closed for business. If we are ever fortunate enough to gain the majority, I hope that we do not emulate this model. I think that not every rule has to be an open rule, but we need a more accommodating process. If you had a more accommodating process, I guarantee you would have more bills that would pass with bipartisan votes. You would have less polarization and less rancor in this House. And again, you know, I'm expressing my frustration as a Democrat, but there are a lot of Republicans that regularly get their amendments blocked as well. And while I don't agree with a lot of those amendments to begin with, nonetheless, it is discouraging when you see this pattern of closed rule after closed rule after closed rule. So I just wanted to, you know, I wanted the record to reflect that we have reached this sad milestone, and I think it's unfortunate, and it's a record that I wouldn't want to break. In any event, I wanted to say that. So, and I do have an amendment that's appropriate to offer it at this time.
Absolutely.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move to strike Section 7 of the rule, postponing the motion to reconsider the Farm Bill. I mean, last week, the majority's heartless partisan Farm Bill failed on the House floor. It was a terrible bill. It reflected a lousy process. You rigged the process, and you still lost. I guess my advice to all of you would be get over it and maybe go back to committee and actually do this right. But don't just leave this monstrosity hanging over the heads of people who rely on SNAP, people who are struggling in this country. We need to go back to the drawing board. We need to start again. We need an inclusive and truly bipartisan process, not one drafted in secret without any democratic input or support. And I find it really strange that that the leadership is trying to buy votes on the Farm Bill over immigration, not on the merits of any of the proposals in the Farm Bill, but on a bill that is not directly related to the Farm Bill. And so I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and let's move beyond this awful Farm Bill and maybe go back to a process that has some integrity. So I urge a yes vote on my amendment.
The committee's heard the gentleman's amendment. I would encourage a no vote on the gentleman's amendment.
You would? Yeah.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reminds us all the time about how we could be doing other things in this committee. And as the gentleman knows, we have a whole host of procedural opportunities to bring the Farm Bill back up. This is the most expedient. This is the one that will bring it to the fastest and waste the least amount of time on that.
That's not true.
That's not true. Yield with the gentleman.
Yeah, that's not true. I mean, under the reconsideration process that the Speaker initiated, you have 2 legislative days to bring it up. You could bring it up faster tomorrow if you wanted to, but you obviously don't have the votes. So this is not the quickest way to bring the Farm Bill back to the floor. It just buys you some time to try to twist some arms and maybe even break a few arms to get these votes.
I agree with everything the gentleman had to say about the nature of a closed process and how we would end up with a better debate if a process was more open. I got elected the year that Democrats actually had a more closed process than we have seen in any year that I have since I have been elected to Congress. You may recall in the 211th Congress, a total of less than 1,000 amendments were allowed during the entire session. Since we've been here in the committee in this Congress, we've done more than 1,000 amendments just since last Friday, the majority of those Democratic amendments. Right. Well, I don't want to contest what the gentleman says, because what the gentleman says is...
I want to contest what you just said, because if I could... Because what you're suggesting is that the number of closed rules somehow doesn't matter. I mean, we don't have the opportunity to even offer an amendment on a bill that is closed, as the gentleman knows. And we're grateful that we will have lots of amendments on the defense authorization bill. That has been the norm for, under Democrats and Republicans. And we're not trying to be dilatory. I mean, I remember one time, then Congressman Jeff Flake offered 500 amendments to one bill. And we worked with him to narrow it down to a handful that he wanted. So we're not engaged. This is not about dilatory tactics, but the gentleman has to be bothered if he ran for office, suggesting that we ought to have more open process. He has to be bothered by the sheer number of open rules. I mean, the number of closed rules, and not a single open rule, not one. The first speaker in history, I think, that has never had a truly open rule. But also, under this Congress, you've had more closed rules than in any other Congress in our history. That's just a fact.
Reclaiming my time, that is a fact. And it is also a fact that every conference report is going to come under a closed rule if we provide a rule for the conference report. And for the gentleman to suggest that we're closing down a process in order to offer a conference report under a closed rule.
We're not counting conference reports in this number.
My point exactly. The gentleman would concede that all closed rules are not created equal. That whether you're doing a conference report or a Congressional Review Act.
No, Congressional Review Act, I differ with the gentleman on that. We just introduced a discharge petition, a Congressional Review Act discharge petition on net neutrality under an open rule. You might want to sign it. So no, there's nothing that says CRAs have to be under closed rules. That's different than a conference report.
Gentleman makes my point exactly. We could agree that the quality of a closed rule is different. We're going to choose not to agree right now, but we could choose to agree. We just heard that from our friends on the Energy and Commerce Committee. Everybody thought the House bill was better than the Senate bill, yet we couldn't move it on a suspension calendar because folks wanted to vote no against a bill that was going to be better than the one that we considered. I agree with the gentleman there. If we spent more time talking with each other instead of accusing one another, we would end up with a better process.
Well, I'm just saying, if the gentleman would yield to me one last time. You can spin this any way you want to, but I'm going to tell you this institution is suffering. And it's not just Democrats that are being denied the opportunity to be heard. There are many Republicans that are also being denied the opportunity to be heard. I don't think that's the way this place should be run. You might want to, you can defend it and issue a press release saying that, you know, they're all justified. They're not. But I would argue with you that this place has become more dysfunctional because of the closed approach to everything. There's been more polarization, less bipartisanship because people are being locked out. And I just point that out for the record. You've passed the important threshold here, in my opinion. And I think no matter whether you guys maintain control of the House or whether we take over, something has to change because this should not be the norm. And so with that, I'm happy to yield back, and I urge a yes vote on my amendment.
Is there any further discussion on the gentleman's amendment? Gentleman's amendment to strike Section 7. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No.
As
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for roll call, please.
Ask for roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Byrne? No. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? No. Mr. Buck? No. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney? No. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Questions on the motion? The gentleman from Georgia, all those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
As for roll call, no.
Gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne. Aye. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Aye. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings. No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis.
No.
Mr. Polis, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
7 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from, the gentle lady, the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Burgess, Dr. Burgess is handling the bill.
And the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, will handle it for the Democrats.
Right.
Yep.
This closes our hearing for today.
So good until the end. I told you.
I didn't see him.